Hi everybody, Professor Cruz here. Welcome to our Week 3 lecture for our World Religions and Global Issues class, where we are turning to focus on religion and ecology. Just as a reminder this week, we're looking at 3 articles: the role of environmental and spiritual ethics in galvanizing nature-based solutions, adapting to climate change and shifting landscapes of belief, and an excerpt from Laudato Si Encyclical by Pope Francis. Again, just kind of start with a bit of the big picture overview for this week's lecture. So as you'll recall in our readings for this week, we looked at another way that religion and global issues sort of intersect and play out in the world today, with a focus on the environment and climate change. Our readings focused on some of the more positive aspects that religion and religious sentiments can play when they're mobilized to help address, for example, the global climate crisis and related environmental challenges, and looks in particular at this idea of promoting what are known as nature-based solutions, or NBS, to address environmental problems, but using the moral power of religion to help encourage nature stewardship as part of these nature-based solutions. We also look at how a number of small villages in southeastern Africa and communities there have been adapting to both the impacts of Christianity and Western science coming in. Looking at a number of communities in Bulero and Malawi and in Monza in Zambia. And in these articles, we'll look at the way that Christianity and traditional beliefs and ecological practices have both worked together and come into conflict in different ways, and with a focus on what's known as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And we'll think about how traditional practices and Christian ideas both can coexist and come into conflict in different situations, and explore why that might be the case. We also want to keep in mind, as the article points out, that some of the most important work going on in the world today, trying to address traditional ecological knowledge, comes from indigenous communities who help us think sort of differently about human-nature relationships, that don't require kind of the same grounding in Western logics and ideas of technology and consumption that many have criticized as part of this bigger problem. And we'll look at what that might mean and why. And then finally, when we're thinking along with Pope Francis, in this chapter we read on ecological awakening and spiritual awakenings and cultural change, and think about how do we address what the Pope describes as our unsustainable relationship and lifestyles with the planet, and how do we create more sort of new, healthy relationships both with each other and with the larger planet we live on. And in particular, Francis will help us think about how can religions help to bring about that kind of change. So that's kind of a big overview of what we're thinking about this week in our lectures. Okay, so in this first article, The Role of Environmental and Spiritual Ethics in Galvanizing Nature-Based Solutions by Abumogli and McCartney, we're kind of diving into this idea of nature-based solutions to think about what they are and how environmental and spiritual ethics might play a role in that story. So as you'll recall, our authors argue that we're currently facing unprecedented multiple crises of climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, zoonotic diseases, amongst many others. And certainly we can think about the current global coronavirus pandemic as one good example of these zoonotic diseases. Now, these changes, our authors note, which have been connected to a whole range of different planetary changes and impacts, have often been linked since the 2000s with this concept known as the Anthropocene, this idea that we are now in a new geologic epoch dominated by human impacts and human-driven changes, and that this is sort of an idea that really tries to think about impacts after 1950, particularly the jump in industrial resource usage, which scholars have been referring to in the last few years as the Great Acceleration. And we'll look at that in just a second. So one of the sets of solutions to try to address these interconnected global problems that we've been exploring, as I noted, are what are called nature-based solutions. And our authors describe this as an umbrella term for various approaches that share common features and are designed to protect the natural environment while addressing societal changes. These approaches are inspired to support and work with nature instead of and using its capacity to heal. So the idea is you're working with nature rather than against nature. And these nature-based solutions offer a number of different strategies for how we might try to address global environmental challenges. And they can also draw on existing religious traditions and secular authorities, state, local, international bodies, and multilateral agencies. So it's a set of ideas that can work across all sort of different spectrums. So this is briefly the idea of the Great Acceleration. You can see 1750 on the far left side of the chart and 2000 on the right. And basically what that idea is trying to capture is, you can see there around 1950, kind of in that post-World War II period, we start to see a massive jump globally of a whole range of resource uses, from financial capital to extraction of fish and foods of different sorts, increasing use of vehicles, increasing CO2, CH4, N2O, and many other species being impacted by these dramatic changes, leading to biodiversity loss, species extinction, and many other things. So this idea of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration try to capture some of these large global shifts and changes that are relatively new to us as a species. Now, Abu Mowgli and McCartney point out that since the climate crisis is rooted in a complex web of economic, social, and cultural factors, as well as belief systems, social attitudes, and perceptions, it's worth considering how these ethics impact our ability to address these broader global climate issues. And they argue that the unsustainable socioeconomic systems and consumption and production patterns that dominate much of the world today arguably reflect these belief systems and social attitudes. So if we want to change this sort of unsustainable model we live in, we need to really look at our belief systems and social attitudes. And as they helpfully remind us, if we look, as we saw last week and the week before, roughly 85% of the world identifies with some religious tradition, many of them with one of the three major religious traditions. And so if many people around the world identify with religion and religious beliefs, then our ethics are going to be similarly grounded in those religious traditions. So if we want to address global environmental crisis, we need to look at the religious traditions and their ethics and how they can contribute to either addressing these problems or perhaps causing some of these problems, as well as think about how do religions and spiritual views produce ethics that might help us address global climate change. So for example, as our authors note, religions arose at a time when people were much more intimately connected to the natural world, gaining their livelihoods directly from it. So this is the large part of the time of human history when we were essentially either hunter-gatherers or pastoralists. But as they note, with technological progress, the impacts of globalization, ever-growing urbanization, and increasing mechanization of agriculture and food production, people today, particularly as they note in mega and big cities, are more detached from nature than ever. And this, importantly, this kind of shift at a global level has created a disconnect between what's contained in these sort of early religious texts and traditions and teachings and the current practices of those that adhere to these religions today. So how do we kind of bridge that gap between agrarian-derived religions and a modern high-tech world and the mismatches that come with those two? So how do we reconnect these agrarian religious ethics with the world that we know today? Well, our authors argue that in this time of unprecedented global environmental degradation, a new environmental ethic based on universally shared values is required, one that places a greater value on nature and connects to spiritual beliefs. They argue that this means we have to reevaluate the rationality of valuing economic growth and material wealth over the health of natural ecosystems, which obviously we all rely upon for our existence. And also they argue it entails embracing diversity and creating a common notion of a moral duty to protect the environment that will allow it to bridge different religious divides and religious communities, while still bringing in their expertise, knowledge, and practices that different faith traditions can provide. So the ultimate aim, they argue, should be that humans learn to live in harmony with nature and with one another. And our authors suggest that nature-based solutions are one way that these religious communities can draw upon their own ethical traditions, not only to promote ecological solutions, but also to help bring these changes about. And they point to, for example, the stewardship traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and ideas about the belief in interdependence that is found among Buddhists and Hindus. Those are just a couple ways that we can think about those connections. Now, our authors go through a number of different examples in the last few decades that help us think about where religion is being mobilized for environmental issues. So, for example, they highlight the World Charter for Nature in 1982, the UNEP United Nations Environment Program, their Seoul Declaration on Environmental Ethics from 1997, the UN Millennium Declaration in 2000, the Tehran Declaration on Environment, Religion, and Culture in 2001, and as you'll recall, there were a number of other declarations that came out around that same period from different traditions, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development from 2016. And obviously we could cite many more, but these are a few that they highlighted. And they also talk about some of the partnerships we've seen, for example, one between the UNEP, the Parliament of World Religions, and the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which produced what was known as Earth and Faith, a book of reflection for action in 2000, which has then been updated just this past year into a new document called Faith for Earth, a call for action, which is essentially kind of an updating of the contents of that original document from 2000. And they also point to other examples, such as the fact that we're now in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which began in 2021 and goes to 2030, as well as efforts, for example, to support the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So all of these, for the authors, are different examples of how religion and environmental issues are kind of being woven together. And they remind us, importantly, part of what makes nature-based solutions so appealing is that they're flexible, adapted, systemic, and grounded in the best environmental science and knowledge, which allows them to be properly implemented not only to create benefits for people, but also for the planet. So really looking at how do we use locally based environmental dynamics to come up with creative solutions for those problems. And we could think about, there's literally thousands of nature-based solutions that we could explore. Just a few to highlight to give you some ideas. Think about restoration and green infrastructure projects, which could range from rural reforestation to urban green space creation. Implementing coastal shoreline restoration projects, such as either restoring or repairing damaged mangroves, wetlands, and marshes, which particularly in coastal areas play a critical role in flood prevention and mitigation. We could look at efforts to remove dams and restore natural waterways and repairing corridors. You can think about examples of installing green roofs and promoting wastewater recycling and composting, encouraging the use of more permaculture and organic agricultural practices, alternative energy systems such as solar, wind, geothermal, microhydro, or run-of-river installations where you're not blocking the entire river itself, and reef recovery projects and various other marine habitat creation and restoration projects. All of these work with the existing natural systems and their dynamics to try to elevate and increase our sort of interplay with them in order to get more benefits out, while at the same time helping, in many of these cases, to actually try to clean up and restore natural systems. So here's just a brief video looking at a few examples of how people are thinking about these nature-based solutions in climate change.
When I think about my childhood, on the corner of my street, we had a great big cherry blossom tree. And I've always thought of those images. And I like to think that even high-level CEOs sitting somewhere in some office have this, and they think about their childhood and they think, oh yeah, there was that rainforest. And I would describe nature-based solutions as basically a return, because I think we all have this innate caring for nature. That's what we all have to go back to.
Nature-based solutions, it's not actually describing something new. It's describing making use of the services that nature provides us to help address climate change.
What we see now is, I think, the realization that all the warnings from the scientists are becoming reality, but we all have also to see the opportunity of tackling climate change, also in terms of green jobs, doing things in a slightly different way. And now it's time for everybody in the world to think about nature-based solutions. They are a good ground to grow and scale.
When you think about agriculture, it's probably the biggest opportunity that we have for addressing climate change. It's right beneath our feet. It's on the ground. It's everywhere, not only for carbon, but also for sustainable development. It's a huge opportunity.
We need models and instruments that help demystify some of this, help reduce perceived risk, and the use of nature-based solutions become much clearer. And we're seeing a lot of appetite from particularly the multilateral financial institutions to help with that.
Tempo de actuar. It is 5 minutes to midnight in the global climate emergency. In short, we need to make national commitments more ambitious in sectors such as nature-based solutions.
The Paris Agreement is built on nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And if countries are looking into their climate contributions, they must talk to the farmers, they must talk to the food sector and factor that in. And I believe agriculture must be centerpiece of the NDCs.
So now we have this upcoming UN decade on ecosystem restoration, and we call it the most important decade of the century, which is until 2030. We've got to do something about climate action, but we've also got to create the world that we want.
I think the landscape approach is one great opportunity going forward with nature-based solutions. So you have to look across all spheres and say agriculture, forestry, local economy, rural development, food industry, so that you actually are able to work with the whole system and not one piece. And then let's work with Earth and not against it.
So it gives you a sense of how some people at kind of a larger international level, particularly through the United Nations, are thinking about these ideas of nature-based solutions. And one of the real benefits about these, as our authors note, is that they can be implemented by religious organizations, by governments, by international and intergovernmental agencies, but also even individual communities and cities. But unfortunately, as we saw there at the very end of that video, there are two real big stumbling blocks to more effective use of nature-based solutions. First one being just kind of a common problem, which is a lack of funding that many efforts and initiatives face. And the other one is that at this point, there's still a lot of weak support from both national governments and private investors in some of these solutions. But yet, these nature-based solutions offer numerous opportunities to forge new sustainable futures, one that can still account for sort of 4 key dimensions described in a lot of sustainable development literature, which are social, economic, environmental, and cultural dimensions. Now, fortunately, as our authors remind us, we don't need to wait on governments or international agencies to be able to promote nature-based solutions. In fact, existing religious institutions can use their resources to start working on these solutions now. For example, in religious schools and places of worship, and properties or lands controlled by religious institutions, and through other resources that they might have access to as religious groups. And perhaps equally important as from those possibilities is that religious groups can use their own influence to help encourage and promote environmental efforts amongst their kind of followers. Now, our authors also remind us that many conservation movements have included ties to religious organizations or were inspired in some way by religious beliefs and teachings. And they note that there's a clear history of environmental considerations within both religion and folk traditions that they suggest we can see reflected in scriptures and practice, many of which go back to the very early origins of religion. And these ideas, precisely these ideas, can be drawn on today to help with not only nature-based solutions, but many larger global climate issues. So just a few examples, some that our authors talked about and some others that are relevant to think about, where we can see these sort of intersections of religion and environmental issues. So they mention ancient Sanskrit texts, the Vedas, and others that emphasize ethical relations between humans and nature. We can think about beliefs in nonviolence towards sentient beings, or ahimsa, which is found in both Buddhism and Jainism. We can think about the Muslim belief in humans as trustees to Allah or to God, Khalifa, and our obligations to care for the world. And the Islamic practice of setting reserved areas aside, known as hima, that can be sort of designated as sacred and protected areas. Examples such as Ethiopian Orthodox churches creating sacred forest groves, particularly in rural areas. Things like the Japanese Shinto belief in spirits, or kami, that are seen to be inhabiting special areas, especially trees and forests that are considered sacred. We can look at examples such as the Maronite Church of Lebanon and their practices to protect the Harissa cedar forests in Lebanon. We can look at EcoSeek's efforts with Guru Nanak's Sacred Forest and projects there that try to take a more kind of holistic, integrated, or interconnected view of human-nature relations. And we can look at Jewish celebrations such as Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees, and religious tree planting rituals and other kind of food and agriculture-based activities that go around Tu B'Shvat as one more of these different examples of how religion and ecology can be integrated, or in some ways have been integrated for a long time. So just a few kind of popular culture examples. We can think about something like the Golden Temple Vegetarian Cookbook, Feast, looking at simple food and reflections from Christian traditions, or something like Wukwan's Korean temple food, looking at the kind of rich integration of simple foods and spiritual practices. So we can kind of think about all the different ways that these religious practices and environmental issues intersect and draw on those possible resources. So as our authors also point out, there's an especially rich tradition around caring for and protecting trees and forests, which goes back probably to the birth of many religious traditions. And we can kind of see the importance of that in the fact that there are many religious shrines or pilgrimage sites that are either in or near ancient forests that are considered sacred. A few examples our authors talk about where we're seeing these kind of ideas put into action include the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which tries to bring religious traditions together to protect tropical rainforests from destruction, and the Living Chapel, an effort to create living sacred spaces that are rooted in sort of interfaith religious practices to help both promote sustainable sort of living, sustainable development ideas, as well as peace-building efforts between religious communities. And there are a number of other different areas of our sort of daily lives that we could think about where nature-based solutions and religion and ecology come into play. So food consumption, from, as we just looked at, vegetarian and temple food, to questions of food security and food waste. How do you, for example, reduce the waste that's produced when religious organizations get together and hold events, picnics or dinners and things like that. Broader ideas of sustainable living, from China's effort to try to develop an ecological civilization to reducing waste at religious gatherings. Greening places of worship is another important one, which could be as simple as adding solar panels to existing infrastructure to promoting recycling and gardening on sort of religious grounds. All these are sort of broader examples of what scholars talk about as the greening of religion, or the idea that religious traditions and practices can help us live a more ecologically responsible life. So here's just a few examples of these church forests in Ethiopia that I was mentioning, and you can see how essentially by putting up a fence around these religious areas, they're able to protect an important part of the landscape that in many of, particularly in parts of Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa, where you have extremely dry areas and a lot of pastoral communities, protecting these trees becomes especially important. Now, most of these practices, as I noted, have been used for millennia, not only in various religious traditions, but especially in indigenous communities who, by and large, wherever we look around the world, live in ways that show and demonstrate a much greater respect for and sort of integration with the natural world, which over a long sort of course of time has led to the protection of many important biodiversity spots on the planet. And we can see this reflected, for example, in the fact that although indigenous communities occupy less than 20% of the planet, they are sort of stewards and safeguarding more than 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world, particularly in tropical rainforest areas and in some cases even temperate rainforests. So as our authors argue, overall there's a close correlation between areas of biological and cultural diversity and most indigenous populations found in areas of megadiversity. These species-diverse environments in which indigenous people live are deeply tied to productive activities and spiritual values. And so seen from that perspective, all creation is sacred, and the sacred and secular are inseparable from belief systems preventing the overexploitation of resources. So really, the sort of ideas of kinship and concentric ethics, and many other examples we could look at, that create a fundamentally different sort of worldview in relationship between humans and the natural world. So these different kinds of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, are an important aspect of nature-based solutions and are certainly central to some of the more creative thinking about how do we develop resilient and adaptive systems in the face of these growing climate uncertainties. And our authors argue that TEK can also show us how to live more in harmony with the natural world around us, rather than trying to force nature to fit into kind of our goals and visions. And these shifts in thinking are really key to why traditional ecological knowledge is so important today. Okay, in our second article, Adapting to Climate Change and Shifting Landscapes of Belief by Murphy, Tembo, Firi, Yerocum, and Grimmel, we sort of shift gears to look at these two case studies from Zambia and Malawi and looking at the sort of interplay and tensions between traditional religious beliefs and practices and sort of influence of Christianity in particular. So as I mentioned, our authors are looking at sort of climate change adaptation in communities in Bulero and Malawi and in Monza in Zambia to try to help us think through what happens when traditional religious beliefs and practices encounter other religious traditions, in this case Christianity. And in this particular article, they're looking at field research and ethnographic work that was done in 26 different villages in these two areas. You can see on the map there, Bulero in the sort of northwest portion of Malawi, and Monza in the sort of central southwestest part of Zambia, close to the Zimbabwe-Zambia border. Now, as Murphy and co-authors argue, social and individual values and worldviews are often determined by religion and spirituality, and these influence decisions about whether and how communities will adapt. While religion has been positively associated with adaptive capacities in many cases through enhancing social capital. At least research suggests that much. But as they also note, when we think about kind of at a broader global scale, the vulnerability to climate change tends to be greatest in the parts of the world where the religion is already very important in daily life. So there's an important kind of connection between strong religiosity and greater vulnerability to climate change. And we'll look at some data on that in a second. It's also important to note in the context of these specific cases where we're looking at traditional African religious beliefs and practices that go back millennia, that Islam and Christianity are relatively new practices to many of these areas. But despite that fact, by 2000, the number of Christians in southern African nations had increased over 70% and Muslims over 20%. And that has also led to a rapid decline in traditional African religious beliefs over this past century. As our authors talk about, we can think about sort of two major waves that have come through. They might be slightly different depending on which part of the African continent we're looking at, but in this area, kind of the southeastern continent, the first wave was really in the 1800s when European and American colonizers and missionaries tried to kind of bring Christian civilization to the dark continent, as they often referred to it. And secondly, in sort of a second set of later waves, that some people would date to the 70s or 80s, but were kind of evident by the 1990s, when we started to see the Africanization of Christianity, and particularly the rise of African independent churches, and kind of a real blossoming of Pentecostal and charismatic forms of Christianity that really took hold in much of Africa. But as our authors also note, many African traditional religious beliefs continue to exist alongside both Christianity and Muslim beliefs, which has led what religious scholars refer to as the process of synchronism or syncretism, where we see kind of hybrid forms of religious beliefs being created by individuals who kind of draw from different traditions without following strictly just sort of one set of ideas. So we can see in the two charts here, on the left you see on the top areas that are more or less vulnerable to climate change, so those in the kind of red are the most vulnerable. And then below we can see the sort of importance of religion in daily life, with green being least important and red being most important. So what we see is that for most of the African continent, but particularly for the sub-Saharan part of Africa, religion is extremely important and climate vulnerability is also extremely high. So again, as our authors were noting, and then we can see on that chart on the left, basically plotting these same ideas again, you see both Malawi and Zambia are high on both climate change vulnerability and importance of religion in daily life. So if we take that argument seriously, that religion is important for dealing with climate adaptation, areas where religion is more important and climate change vulnerabilities are higher, should be good places to try to see what's going on with these dynamics. Now, these sort of local practices and tensions have given this challenge where you have local environmental challenges and older animistic religious practices and rituals coming into conflict with more dogmatic monotheistic beliefs brought in by Islam and Christianity. So for example, as our authors noted, traditional belief systems are often intricately intertwined with traditional ecological knowledge, in which spirituality is rooted within the ancestral spirit world and built from adaptive processes of trial and error of living with the land. So TEK is a knowledge-practice belief complex, they argue, that has long been the organizing attractor around which the culture and practice of rural community life has persisted. And as our authors also point out, there are sort of three key aspects of traditional ecological knowledge and its relation to local adaptive capacities. So these include the qualitative monitoring of change for early warning by individuals or communities. So recognizing that, for example, certain plant species maybe are appearing earlier, or that there's less of a certain food source than there had been that past season. Second of these sort of TEK capacities is the protection of important refuges that facilitate recovery after disturbances, such as sacred groves, taboos against using specific plants and animals that will allow areas to kind of cope and recover more quickly. And then finally, the practice of rituals that help to pass on institutional memory and facilitate communal responses to pressures. So the challenge, our authors argue, that many traditional communities face from outside religions like Christianity and Islam is that they're not only often not responsive to these local dynamics, but they can often be hostile to them as well. And this leads to a kind of a breakdown of what had been far more successful conservation practices, because they're now conflicting with these new outside religious beliefs and practices. And our case studies in both Malawi and Zambia clearly kind of highlight what these tensions look like. So the two case studies we looked at give us some specific examples where changing religious beliefs have affected the adaptive capacity of rural communities. And at the same time, they show us that we can have communities where you have multiple belief systems held, and sometimes they'll be in sort of working cooperatively, other times they'll be in conflict. But regardless, the fact that these belief systems are there does have a noticeable effect on climate-sensitive livelihood practices, particularly, as our authors argue, related to food production and associated communal rituals. So, for example, the researchers found that cultural changes caused by changing religious beliefs between generations, which was particularly important, does impact the adaptive capacities of communities to respond to climate change. In particular, one impact they found, changes were being driven by kind of hostile evangelicals or charismatics, particularly, as they noted, embodied by a growing number of Pentecostals in some of the communities, who basically outright rejected these older traditional religious beliefs and practices. And that hostility has disrupted traditional ecological practices, traditional TEK, by substituting often in their place a reliance on new kinds of Western technology and agricultural practices, which aren't connected to kind of long-standing traditional beliefs and religious traditions, and are often brought in by these outside faith-based organizations. So as our authors argue, the importance of TEK in building adaptive capacity is well established. However, in both communities, our findings suggest that changing beliefs are undermining the effectiveness of TEK management practices. And they note, for example, that interviewees noted concern that the expansion of Christian religions is affecting the preservation of TEK practices, particularly through non-adherence to taboos deemed important for preserving systems resilience. And they noted, particularly on the case or regarding young people who are no longer sort of respecting these taboos. So if we look at kind of side by side these two case studies, we see that in Malawi, Balero is a densely populated rural area that's about 95% Christian and largely made up of the Tumbuka ethnicity. Some of the risks they face include environmental degradation, climate variability, erratic rainfall, droughts, land shortages, food insecurity, and the constant threat from HIV and AIDS. There's been strong organized social relations and leaders historically. There's also sort of a long-standing set of traditional religious taboos around eating certain foods, protecting certain sacred trees, and emphasizing group identity as more important than individual identity. And they noted how Chuta, which was the local name for God in some of these communities, is seen as being responsible for disasters, but can also be kind of invoked or interceded through the ancestors to help bring rain when needed. They talked about using the Singango, or medicine men, to drive out evil spirits who are preventing rain, possibly causing sickness, if other sort of rituals don't seem to be successful. And they also noted that historically the Timbuka had a good relationship, or at least a relatively good relationship by historical standards, with their Presbyterian Livingston missionaries who came into the area of what's now modern-day Malawi, who in general were more respectful of local traditions and practices than in other areas. Now, by contrast, if we look at Monza in Zambia, this area is mostly agricultural and pastoral area, about 87% Christian and 12% traditional, made up of different Baitonga or Tonga ethnicities. And some of the risks there include problems, again, with rain-fed crops and agriculture, lack of agricultural grazing land, particularly for cattle, and the constant threat of droughts. Unlike with Malawi, there was never kind of the same level of organized state or social relations and centralized leadership as we saw in the Malawi case. They talked about how the Tonga rain shrine, the Malende, is really important as a place where rain spirits live and are key to two of the Luwindi rain rituals, which take place in July and August, that correspond to important agricultural cycles. In fact, the region itself derives its name from a former chief, Monza, who was seen as a prophet who was able to control rain through the Luwindi ritual. Now, importantly, these Luwindi rituals not only forecast rain for the coming season so people know when to sort of do their planting, but they also serve as a way to thank local ancestral spirits and divinity amongst sort of tribal belief systems. So remember, we've got lots of different tribes coming together here. And that kind of serves as a unifying force in a certain way around these practices, sort of reinforcing communal identities. But unfortunately, unlike with the case of Malawi, in Tonga, or sort of in Zambia with the Tonga, they had very contentious relationships with, at the time, the British South African Company and Christian missionaries who both tried to undermine and resist local religious leadership and practices, including arresting and killing a number of important figures in the past. So very different relationships to both internal and outside dynamics. Now, if we think about how religion and ecology play out in these two cases, what we see is that in Bulero and Malawi, there's largely been a smooth coexistence and integration of both traditional religious practices and Christianity. And in fact, traditional leaders noted that there's a lack of tension between the different belief systems. Instead of being kind of competing, they often offer sort of different ways of approaching or addressing problems and forms of knowledge. And these were kind of associated with traditional ecological knowledge on one hand, as sort of the native traditions, and sort of Western science being this kind of new, brought in outside Christian idea. Importantly, village elders often served both as traditional religious leaders and church leaders, which helped legitimate both sets of practices and allow them to exist more sort of co-harmoniously. And importantly, they noted that the faith-based organizations are not necessarily always viewed as sort of outsiders bringing in outside information, but also helping to bring in new kind of scientific insights, such as the authors note. In the past, many in the Bulero villages thought that, for example, droughts or climate variability was caused by ancestral spirits who might have been upset with the village. And now they can understand that maybe there's some bigger climate story going on that's not just about sort of local issues and practices. By contrast, in Monza and Zambia, what we see is deep conflicts between traditional religions and Christianity, particularly Pentecostal and Evangelical forms of Christianity. There, Western science and agricultural techniques are seen as in opposition to traditional ecological knowledge and religious rituals, particularly a Luwindi ritual. As noted, rain forecasts, so villagers are told, don't rely on these rituals to tell you when the rain's going to come, rely on the meteorological society and their predictions. But as they noted, the rain forecasts are only in English, which is not useful for many people who don't understand or speak English, and often that same information is not reliable either. So they noted in times people have relied on that, and then there wasn't going to be a drought according to the forecast, and there was. So it made people lose crops and face even more hardships. Perhaps most importantly, though, they noted that Tonga sort of followers of traditional Luwindi rituals have often been victimized by Christians, called devil worshippers and fetishes, and risk communal shunning and even expulsion from the church, which can have a major impact on individuals within that community if they're now excluded from much of communal life. So as our authors note here, tensions between belief systems emanated from the practice of rituals, the use of Western science and technology, and seasonal forecasting of rain, and between generations. So community members, again, associated Christian religions with certain knowledge forms, specifically Western science, and particularly, as they note, through the presence of faith-based organizations who are focused on agricultural development and climate change adaptation. So you can see just a few examples here from the Luwindi Gonda, which are the ceremonies that take place in Zambia in July and October. And these are just a few images from festivals between 2015 and 2018. You can see in the top left there one of the shrines where the sorghum beer and other offerings are being made to the ancestral spirits. You can see in the bottom right and in the center some of the local tribal chiefs who were leading ceremonies at the beginning of different processions. At the top you can see one of the many groups there that have come to do dances as part of the ceremonies and rituals. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what these are like, here's a brief clip from one of these Luwindi ceremonies in Zambia.
The Maja TV channel crew went to Monza for the Luwindi Gonda ceremony, a traditional ceremony for the Tonga people which takes place every year. Gonda is a Tonga word which means thick forest. The forest is near the area where the ceremony takes place, and this place is very sacred for the Tonga people because this is where the two Tonga chiefs were buried. And this place is also a place where they communicate with their ancestral spirits.
So as our authors also noted when they were interviewing elders in the different villages, they noted, for example, that certain local sacred tree species play an important role in retaining moisture for crop production during periods of drought, which allows farmers to continue growing during extreme weather periods. But as more young people begin to embrace Christianity, they're no longer paying attention to local taboos, such as not cutting down these tree species, which has led to an increase in deforestation, more problems with drought, and other related agricultural problems, which traditional religious advocates in part blamed on the fact that the young people are both neglecting these taboos and no longer paying kind of the respects to ancestral spirits and through these ancestral traditions and rituals. So for example, as one Tonga elder noted, I was in the process of initiating my son as a priest of the shrine, but he is lost into evangelical churches. He is no longer cooperating. He considers the shrine evil. And as the authors noted, this trend is especially strong where charismatic Pentecostal churches are growing or are already dominant. So in Bolero, there's evidence that communities recognize the utility of pluralistic beliefs and practices in livelihood activities around food production, merging the blending beliefs and practices in different situations. In Monza, by contrast, changing religious beliefs have introduced tensions around the practices of TEK, which are playing out in how associated knowledge types are considered valid or not in agricultural decision-making and related practices with direct implications for livelihood decisions. So as our authors suggest, culture, here approached through the lens of religious beliefs and practices, plays an important role in adaptive capacity, but it's not static. We find that in communities holding multiple belief systems, adaptive capacity is largely determined by the manner in which belief systems coexist. And we saw that very clearly in the difference between Bolero and Monza. Religious beliefs have tangible influences on lived practices of individuals and communities and vice versa, and are an important determinant of adaptive capacity. In the context of changing religious beliefs, adaptive capacity will be determined by how epistemological and intergenerational frictions are negotiated by both individuals and communities, and ultimately how different forms of knowledge are valued, accepted, and integrated. Okay, that wraps up the first part of this week 3 lecture, and we'll continue with part 2 very soon. Okay, thanks everybody.